نتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لسعادة الدكتور علي بن عامر الشيذاني راعي افتتاح الندوة الدولية. تبدأ بعد قليل أعمال الجلسة الأولى والتي تديرها الأستاذة الدكتورة زهور الخنجرية من كلية العلوم في جامعة السلطان قابوس.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for informing us, just Shahid, for starting our session 1 of the symposium. So we welcome all of you for the opening of the session 1 of the symposium. We will start, inshallah, with Professor Dr. Dirk. Professor Dr. Dirk is a professor with the invited, of course, just a speech for today, the first invited speech for our symposium. He is a professor here. Professor Dirk, a professor of the open source software at the Friedrich Alexander University from Germany. Before joining academy, of course, just Professor Riehle led the open source research group at SAP Labs in Paulo, California. Professor Riehle holds a PhD in computer science from ETH Zurich and MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business. Welcome with me, Professor Dirk, to deliver his invited speech. I kindly invite all audience to write their questions if they have any question for Prof. Dirk in the Q&A box, please, provided in the session. Please welcome with me, Prof. Dirk. Dirk, the floor is yours. Please deliver your invited speech, the first speech in the in session 1 for the symposium. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Fabulous. I'll be sharing my screen. So I hope you will also be able to see my screen in a second. All good?
Prof, you have 40 minutes to deliver your speech and then 5 minutes for the questions, please.
All right, thank you. I was just making sure that you could hear me and could see my screen. So it seems like you can. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about a topic that is dear to my heart, called user-led open source consortia. The idea is about users of software being able to help themselves through open source, even if there is no such open source software existing yet. So first, perhaps the question, why do you even care about open source software? I assume everyone knows that, but the reason is mostly, or for many, that with traditional closed source software, the original alternative, arguably, you might end up in so-called vendor lock-in, which means you are tied to the software of a particular vendor, and it costs you, it will create high migration costs to move away. Once you're locked in like that, a closed source vendor, which is a for-profit enterprise, is likely to increase fees to a level that may be unsustainable for you. But it's not just the cost of the software. There's an operational risk if the vendor goes out of business, because many products, trains, planes, cars are long-lived, sometimes longer-lived than the original vendor. And if you need something changed about the software, you can't get it done easily because it's closed source. So if you see a market window of opportunity for yourself and you need the software to change in accordance with that, it can't easily. So that's why one reason why we have open source software. So by definition, open source software is software that's free of charge, available to you to use, to modify, and to distribute on. So that is a classic definition by the artifact, the software itself. So regular software becomes open source software if it's given to you under a license that has these properties, free of charge, use, modification, and distribution. As we dive into what's possible with open source, it's important to understand that this is purely focused on the artifact, and that hence you need to distinguish different types of open source software, namely, in one dimension, those that are developed by a community, which I call community open source software here, and commercial or single vendor open source software, which does not have a community that is developing it. So examples of community open source is the PostgreSQL database or the Apache web server. And community means that next to the license, there's an open governance process, a process in which everyone can participate. So the ownership of the software then, because everyone can contribute, is widely shared, and no single entity, company, could monopolize the software. That's different with the what I call single vendor open source software here. There are companies who provide to you software under an open source license, so it's open source software, but then you cannot participate in the governance process. So the software remains still under lock, arguably, by a vendor. So it's important to make this distinction between community open source with an open governance process and single vendor open source, which pretty much is like closed source except for the license, but certainly with respect to the process. I will only be talking about community open source. If you're listening and if you're thinking, oh, wait a second, that's not true for my favorite open source project, then maybe that open source project in your mind is not community open source, but rather said single vendor open source. And the reason why you need to make that distinction is that openness of the software, the ability to adapt the software to your needs, to stay current, depends on whether we are looking at community open source or single vendor open source. Community open source, carried forward by a large community of diverse stakeholders who all share in the ownership of it, has a continued openness as long as the project is doing well. These single vendor open source firms usually start out open quickly, but then over time, as the products mature based on this software, it will close down openness until you end up with something that's pretty much closed source. So again, I will focus on community open source. When the world realized the importance, the commercial significance of open source, including, or mostly then, community open source, it realized that it also needed to find ways of sorting out disagreements on the software. Where should the software go? Which features to do, and so forth. And for that, we got the so-called open source foundations. So when the companies realized the value of open source software, they also realized we need to find a way of dealing with differences in opinion and differences on strategy as we contribute to these open source projects. And as a solution, they founded or use open source foundations. So an open source foundation is a nonprofit organization. So you incorporate as a nonprofit organization and put an open source project under the guidance of that foundation. So an open source foundation is a nonprofit organization with the mission of managing, sponsoring, developing all these open source software projects of commercial relevance. And it's not just software in general, but it's then really open source software. The three classic examples are the Apache Software Foundation. I hope you may be familiar with them. The Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, and the Linux Foundation. These are the three big foundations with a lot of open source projects under their guidance, and they give these projects a lot of certainty and sustainability that otherwise would not be there. Now, when a project is part of these foundations, the project is not so dependent on the individuals in the project any longer. The trademarks associated with the software are now under the leadership or with the supporting foundations, which can represent the projects in court should someone be abusing the trademarks and so forth. In reverse, if someone wants to use the trademark, then the foundation provides a good way of clear rules of using those trademarks. So these open source foundations make sure that everyone plays well with each other. It creates an equal, fair, and level playing field for its members, with clear governance and intellectual property rules. It still depends on people and interests. So a well-done foundation achieves what I just described, but it's also possible for things to go wrong. So here are 3 examples of challenges to open source projects. The first one, tricky, is a simple one. The original owner of the trademark was not willing to give it into a foundation. So anyone providing commercial services around Tricky worried that there might be a cease and desist on using the name, the word Tricky, and hence they forked the open source project, let go of the original project, and basically created a new one, and that was disruptive to the business. BERT, the second example, is actually a project under the guidance of an open source foundation, but even then it's possible to not behave properly. Like in this case, the open source project decided for a long time not to let really a community be built around the project. The executive director of the foundation behind it could have stepped in and changed that. That's actually the resolution capability of an open source foundation, but they're usually hands-off, so they didn't like to do that. The final example, now mostly fixed, is OpenStack, where there was so much commercial interest around the layers of this cloud computing stack that there were clauses in the bylaws of the foundation that did not quite achieve that fair and equal playing field. But you can achieve it, and many have achieved it. So what now can an open source foundation do? We need to dive in deeper. First, I made a distinction between community open source, where nobody can monopolize it, and single vendor open source. Now, when we look at community open source, we need to distinguish further between components for use in products, which are usually jointly developed by product vendors, and applications for use in running your business, which are often developed or sponsored by the users of the software, not necessarily for use in products. So components for use in products, that's straightforward. Everybody who develops software probably needs a math library. So everyone wants that library, may contribute to it. Everyone wants nice user interfaces, so maybe everyone uses or helps a library for developing beautiful user interfaces. But it doesn't stop there. These were math and user interfaces, everyone needs it, but it also goes into business domains. So FORDIAC is a software for process control and automation in machine manufacturing machines. Not every company produces machines. So that's a domain-specific example of open source software jointly developed by the vendors who need that software in their business for their product, I wanted to say. So again, when you look at software, you can now distinguish, you can see the components that vendors put into products. And I am now focusing for the rest of this talk on the other type of software, applications to operate your business. And these applications are not put into a product you sell to a customer. And so examples of that are, so that's often needed by everyone in the business domain. So a general example is LibreOffice, which is software, which is an alternative to Microsoft Office. And so pretty much everyone may need Office software. But again, it gets domain specific. So GNU Health is software to run hospitals. So not every business is a hospital, but certainly there are lots of hospitals. And their product is patient care. and patient healing, etc. But to operate, they need software. So GNU Health is an application that lets them do that. Finally, my colleagues in computer science always point out that we are users too. So even software developers need applications to run their business where the applications don't make it into the product. And that would be programming environments, or here the example of software version control, Git. Git is an application for the users, actually by the users and developers. And this type of software application now is needed by companies who are not software developing companies primarily. So hospitals are not in the business of developing software and selling it. Again, hospitals are in the business of providing patient care. So what these businesses who need this software do or should be doing is sponsor or participate in the development, but often sponsor because they don't have the development capacity. We can now distinguish these two types of software by their use and use case. So again, we have components which are put into products, and such open source projects are typically led by the product vendors who need these components for their products. It's their primary interest to get these components in high quality so that the resulting products become of equally high quality or better. Software applications are often usually led by the users of those applications because it's their primary interest again. But the difference is they are not components put into products, they are used to operate the business. And here comes an important distinction. Vendors jointly working on components face the problem that the components, well, none of the open source software can be competitively differentiating, meaning everyone can have the open source software, and hence it does not give anyone a particular advantage in the marketplace. So open source software is always competitively not differentiating, and an open source foundation again provides that level playing field where there are clear rules of how to deal with potential conflicts. When I talk now about components versus applications, I also now want to take this further with respect to open source foundations, because we can see how different forms of open source foundations are emerging. The original open source foundations, Apache, Linux, Eclipse Foundation, focused for the longest time on components for products. That's because those who understood open source first were the software product vendors. When Linux came about, all the other companies that were not Microsoft realized this is a potent alternative to Windows. When the Eclipse Foundation came about and their original open source software, the Eclipse IDE, they realized this was against Microsoft Visual Studio and OpenStack later against Amazon Web Services. So it was the vendors who drove the open source foundations for the last 20 years. And that is changing based on that distinction I just explained between components for products by vendors and applications by and for users to operate a business. And this second applications for your business is creating a different type of open source foundation, which I call open source consortium in this case, because it's really a consortium, but I use consortium and foundation interchangeably, synonymously here. So an open source foundation that is specifically what I call here a user-led open source foundation or consortium is exactly that, led by users who manage the development of the software because they need it for their business. And they usually manage and sponsor the development. They don't necessarily contribute by programming the code of the open source software project. This only works like with every open source foundation. If, well, it's open source in the first place, that's jointly being developed because that has a clear license and everyone has clear and well understood rights to the software. But also, again, if the software is competitively non-differentiating. You can only join forces and jointly work on something if it is mostly a cost factor. You need it to operate, but it doesn't make a difference in the marketplace, say, between two companies who are jointly working on that open source software. Here's an example of how a company can both be a vendor and an application user and decide on contributing by putting in development hours versus paying for development. Audi, a company near where I live, develops a lot of open source software, contributes to a lot of open source software components that make it into the infotainment stack, the software in the center console of a car. Here, Audi, even though it's an automotive OEM, a car company, actually has a lot of software developers that are developing software for their products, cars. At the same time, Audi needs software to operate its manufacturing plants. Here, for example, it's sponsoring the OpenMDM project, which comes in a second. And that project, they don't develop the software, they just sponsor it. So let me give you a couple of examples of open source consortia that have emerged over the last 10 years to illustrate this trend. The first example is dear to my heart. It's the Open Consequence open source foundation. It's incorporated in Germany as a cooperative. That's the legal standing of the organization. And it manages and sponsors the development of open source software for local energy distributors and the smart grid challenges they face in Germany. So it's Germany focused, all right, but I think the pattern would apply in other countries as well. It's the local energy distributors, not the long distance ones. It's the one who manage the last kilometer to your house in terms of energy, distribution, gas, electricity, and so forth. They need a lot of software, in particular in Germany, all that sun created energy is flowing back into the network, creating new challenges. And for that, they decided to join forces. And it was the local energy distributors, with my help, when we set it up 10 years ago, who are in the driver's seat. So it's not some software vendors trying to sell these local energy distributors some software. It is the local energy distributors themselves who were dissatisfied with the closed source software solutions they could get in the market. And they decided they need to take their fate into their own hands and jointly develop said open source software. Here's a second example. So the Open Consequence Consortium is a standalone consortium they decided to incorporate by themselves. Here's a second example, the OpenMDM that I just mentioned, project, which develops software for measured data management, so test data management to collect all the test data as you're producing goods. And that is incorporated, or that is represented as a working group of the Eclipse Foundation. So remember, the Eclipse Foundation is an existing generic open source foundation that hosts many open source projects. Audi, as a leader of the OpenMDM project, decided they don't want to incorporate on their own. They just want that equal and level playing field provided to them by someone, here the Eclipse Foundation, because the Eclipse Foundation has a lot of experience with that. So they just decided to become a working group. And As I started explaining a few minutes ago, OpenMDM is interesting because Audi is a technology company, so they are close to software. Software is not something weird to them. They develop a lot of software for their products. But OpenMDM is a business application they use to operate for their plants. So it's a different category of software. And given how short everyone is on enough software developers, Audi decided the software developers are for those components that make it into products, while the software they need or use for their own operations, maybe they can sponsor that, or that's what they do. They pay others, consultancies, to develop this software for them. But as open source software, under the guidance of the Eclipse Foundation, by the rules, by the governance rules of the working group in the Eclipse Foundation. And a third example. I love this example because it's so different from what most are expecting. The Academy Software Foundation is a Linux Foundation collaboration project. So like with OpenMDM, they decided not to incorporate by themselves, but rather become a project of an existing open source foundation, here the Linux Foundation. And this time it's the movie producers. The movie producers need a lot of software too. It's not their product is movies, it's experiences. But they need software to create those for operating the business. So the Hollywood movie producers decided, we need all that software. We don't like the vendor lock-in into closed source software. We join forces to sponsor the development of software as open source software to run our business. Here, there's another twist to the model. They are actually successful in adopting existing software and turning it into open source software. But again, they also sponsor a lot of development. While the Open Consequence Consortium decided it needed its own organization, OpenMDM decided it's fine with an industry working group and the Eclipse Foundation. The Eclipse Foundation gives the projects, the OpenMDM gives them a lot of flexibility in how the charter of the working group looks like. But the Linux Foundation gives the Academy Software Foundation even more flexibility because every single project here can be instantiated as its own company, a US-based company using the concept of serious LLCs, but nevertheless, even legally protected with its own bylaws, with its own rules within a separate company. The three examples I just gave you are really the tip of the iceberg. This is both user-led consortia, both the research topic for me as a professor, as they are a consulting topic for my consulting company. And so we collected examples of user-led projects and consortia, and it's more than 100 such projects continuously increasing. Originally, those who are close to technology found it easier to say, let's join forces to develop the applications we need to run our business with as open source software, but it's increasingly more diverse. That's why I use the Academy Software Foundation. The Symposium is about education, so there's the Quali Foundation, there's the Open Library Foundation, there is Pereo, there's a lot of open source software in the educational space. There's a lot of open source software in the healthcare space. There's a lot of open source software in the financial space. So all of these recognize this pattern. If we work together, we have lower costs and we avoid vendor lock-in, and that lets us take charge of our own future better than when they stayed with closed source solutions. So how could this possibly work? After all, the expectation is you're working together. That's always tricky. There's no big boss. You have to negotiate. How do you collaborate? When does it work? When will it not work? So again, open source software really only works well, or the development as a community of open source software only really ever works well if the organizations or participants in the community are aligned in their goals. So they can't be competing with each other directly on that particular piece of software they are developing. Remember, the vendors, they may be competing on products built on top of these components, but the specific components they jointly develop, they're not competing on those. They're just producing costs. Everyone needs them. They're not a differentiator in the marketplace. So when are you not competing? Well, businesses from very different domains are not competing. If you're a bank, if you are an oil and gas producer, and if you're a hospital, then you're not directly competing, but maybe there's software that you all need. More likely, same businesses from the same industry, but that are somehow kept apart. My local energy distributors in the Open Consequence Consortium, they have divvied up Germany into their responsibilities. Yeah? They're literally geographically separated from each other. The city of Nuremberg does not compete with the city of Munich, does not compete, or the local energy distributors behind the city of Munich and the city of Berlin do not directly compete with each other. So sometimes you have legal separations and geographic separations that ensure that you are not fighting with each other over customers. And so you're not competing directly with each other. Governmental organizations. So the various agencies in Germany and elsewhere, they just have a focus. They are not competing, but a lot of the software they need is the same. And then countries. There are many things that all countries need that's not really a competitive differentiator. An example I will have later is single-payer healthcare systems. Every country wants some software to operate its healthcare system. If you want a single-payer healthcare system, why on earth is everyone inventing their own software? So, and even sometimes competing organizations can collaborate if what they are collaborating on is not competitively differentiating. Now, when you look at this, so maybe you're thinking, oh, it would be so nice to have, let's use hospital software. Maybe you don't like New Health. Maybe you want something else. Why don't our hospitals collaborate, jointly sponsor the development of software we need, or jointly sponsor the education of the university, sponsor the development of software they need for the operation of a university. So you have some boundary conditions that make things work more nicely, more smoothly or not. Clearly, if you want it to, if you want the software, if you want the consortium to develop open source software as applications, then the users of these applications should be driving the project or the projects if it's multiple. So all of these examples I gave you do have tiered memberships levels. So you can be one of different memberships. And usually the premier members or driver members, those are the users who also pay for the development, but then they are driving the show and the software is for their use. You can still allow vendors or consultancies to become members, but many of these consortia do not accept them as driver members. I don't think it's necessary to keep things apart like this, but that's what the existing consortia are doing. Another key aspect of open source is that even if you have a foundation, you don't meddle with the projects too much, but rather you give them a charter and manage through the charter. There's a lot of depth in getting governance right, and it's easy to get it wrong, as examples show. You can do your own, like I helped the Open Consequence Cooperative develop its governance, and I very much enjoyed that, but it was actually their decision. It was not my advice to incorporate by themselves, but they wanted to, they wanted that independence, so I helped them. you can simply go to an existing foundation and ask them or tell them, we want to sponsor this open source project for healthcare or education, and we need a home for that, which helps us get governance right, so that whoever we pay to develop the software does so in our interests ultimately. And there you can go, for example, to the 3 classic, but also some others, to the 3 classic open source foundations and ask them for help. This is a very simple model. I'm not sure it's entirely correct, but Apache is very cheap, meaning you don't actually have to pay anything, but they will help you, but they also insist on you following the one and only Apache way. On the other extreme, the Linux Foundation will cost you a lot of money, but they will make it right by you, meaning you can customize pretty much everything in those LLCs as you see fit, as long as you stay in the umbrella of the open source spirit. The Eclipse Foundation also gives you a lot of flexibility, but tends to be a bit cheaper than the Linux Foundation. So how do you finance any such development? Usually through membership fees, though a lot of those projects are directly paid for, meaning the driver members of the users decide we need a new application or a new component for an existing application, and hence let's pay in to get that developed. And so it's often not just general membership fees, but project-specific decisions to sponsor the development. Economically, you need to think it through. How could that work? It's actually a bit more complicated than just buying software from a closed source vendor, because you create a 2-tiered ecosystem. Now, the goal of the user-led open source consortium is actually to create such a 2-tiered ecosystem where on the one hand, there's competitively non-differentiating open source software, the applications you want to run your business off. And then, because those users are not IT companies, they're not from the software industry, they simply in the end want to buy products and services still. You need to structure the ecosystem such that commercial entities from the software industry can turn those user-led open source software applications into products for you. Now, these products are much less deep in terms of who owns the intellectual property than the traditional closed source. A product may just be repackaging of the open source application. And you may wonder, why would I pay for that if it's all free? Well, because the vendor will give you something in addition to the open source. So the whole point here is, yes, there's open source software, but open source software somewhere in the World Wide Web does not make for an application you can readily use in your data center or run in your cloud. So on top of the open source applications, most users still pay for a second time to buy that open source software as a product or as a service from some vendor. Now, if you're thinking, whoa, wait a second, I'm paying twice, this makes no sense, you need to realize that the total cost of both sponsoring with others the original open source project and then buying a product or service based on it, that the total cost of that is much lower than the closed source software one-time fee or subscription fee that you're paying. So in total, it's cheaper. And if you do it right, I'll come to that in a second, but if you do it right, you can still prevent that lock-in, which will keep fees low, which will let you keep your own sovereignty. Not to mention that it's open source software, which if everything fails, you can still run entirely by yourself. So not having the lock-in has these long-term economic benefits. Going back to today then, preventing fee increases. So now it gets tricky. It is still possible to get locked in. I want to give you a realistic picture. Companies lock you in by exclusive IP. if you depend on some exclusive intellectual property of some company, it can cost you a lot to migrate away. So as I'm suggesting that user-led open source consortia are a good idea, you still need to do it in such a way that you don't run into vendor lock-in right away. So when you look back here, obviously the products can't be fairly different from the projects, or there would be vendor lock-in. So let's take a look at how companies might, for-profit entities, that's the business, might catch you again and might lock you in again. So in open source is a business strategy. Open source is also a way to get you locked in if you're not paying attention. So for example, and open source, okay, so how do companies make money off open source? They always make money not by the open source software itself, but by a complement. Something that is not in the open source, something that is exclusive to them, so that you have to pay for it. Examples here are hardware complements. Google TensorFlow is a very good machine learning library, so for programming software using machine learning, and it's free, provided by Google. Now, Google makes money because if you use that software and you kind of get dependent on the software, but your own hardware doesn't let you compute those machine learning models fast enough, Google can offer you its tensor processing units, dedicated hardware, which makes your program scream, meaning it runs really, really fast. So once you got logged in, or once you started using open source Google TensorFlow, and you need more computing power, there's only the option of buying Google's tensor processing units in their data centers. So that's the complement. That's how Google makes money off the public machine learning library. Apache Lucene is a search software, a company which has commercialized it. If you use enterprise search by Elastic, you get logged in by the additional software that Elastic has developed on top of Apache Lucene. So that's the complement, how they make money, but also the lock-in. You can get locked in by the capability of some company to operate some software well. So here's a German company, Creative, which operates Postgres for you, etc. Consulting and support as well. So the difference here is hardware and software is hard intellectual property with a hard exclusion right, meaning if you want to use this hardware or software that is not freely available, you have to pay the vendor. You can't easily switch. Operating software in the cloud is easier, so you might more easily switch between companies who provide that operations service to you. Consulting and support equally so. So with that, operations, consulting, and support is nothing to be feared, or much less to be feared than lock-in through complementary hardware and software. So how do you avoid getting locked in again? Well, one way is using an open source license that prevents the creation of exclusive IP by a vendor in conjunction with the open source software. That's what copyleft licenses can be used for. So by way of a license, you can fight the danger of vendor lock-in. It has a downside, which is it makes for a less attractive market for companies to provide services. But it is nevertheless a path that many choose. So with that, let me come to a close. If you're wondering, is this for us? Here are some examples. Until recently, DHIS2, it's an open source software for tracking health information in countries, was not well funded. But now with the current pandemic, it actually got a lot of funding, so now it's in a good state. There are lots of neglected open source projects that are really valuable. OpenIMIS is a single-payer healthcare software developed by Schweizer Eidgenossenschaft and GIZ, so these two governmental organizations, but it's for other countries. These Switzerland and Germany don't need another healthcare payment system. So it's for countries in Africa, uses and they definitely would need more support. So here is some existing open source software, which is already doing very well, but in need of more sponsors who start driving the software for broader use and so forth. But of course, you can identify your own needs and start your own open source consortium. And what that might be, maybe for those listening, maybe something in the oil and gas business, I don't know. But as you look at that, and as I look at the next speaker, you may also want to keep in mind that while I focus on applications, there are also other aspects of software, and most notably security, that you may want to get into your own hands. So security and securing the open source software supply chain, that is currently driven, once again, by American companies who are not even, and that is something you might want to take into your own hands as well. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope I left at least time for a little bit of question. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Prof. Dirk, for the great speech, which was interesting, of course, for all of us to be, hearing actually all this rich information. I think we have in Q&A, if you can just, see the questions. We have 3 questions. Can you access them, Prof? I
actually do not see any questions. Where are they?
Okay, they are in the box just down, in the Zoom Q&A.
Yeah, I have the chat open, but
no, not chat, Q&A.
There's a Q&A section. All right.
Yes, please.
All right. Do you think that corporates and critical infrastructure and others prefer to adopt vendor-led open source? So the question is, what's the risk in using these different software pieces? So here is single vendor open source software versus community open source software. In addition, you can have closed source software. So with closed source software, you usually get quality software from one hand and your life is easy, except for all the downsides of the vendor lock-in. So it may get expensive, but also, well, what if you need to modify the software? You can't. What if the vendor goes out of business and the software lands in escrow? So not great. Is single vendor open source software better because it's one vendor who makes the first version of the software available to you for free as open source software? So you have a bit less of a lock-in because you can possibly for a while go back to that open source software. So there's less risk than with a traditional closed source software vendor. But when you look at this openness over time curve here, the green line, the lower line, that's the openness over the life cycle of such single vendor open source or vendor-led software. Eventually, they will stop updating the software. You will not get new versions. This is a very deep topic. I actually very much like it. I am just explaining the situation. I have nothing against single vendor open source firms. I actually really care about this business model. But it does mean that it is a for-profit entity that will try to lock you in. So over time, when it penetrated the market or its market, the software will become less open. And ultimately, you end up with the same as in closed source software. So community open source software as a third option, again, requires more of an effort in the beginning, but has a sustained long-term perspective for your overall risk. So you always need to look at time. If you pull everything forward, basically discounting future time into today, I think community open source, if you have the ability to operate such foundations, such projects, community open source is still your best option. Then we saw a trend from open source and closed source trying to influence community through funding. Well, that depends. Bringing funding isn't bad in itself. It's a question of whether there is anything attached to the funding. In general, open source welcomes contributions by people, by companies, And if the project is working well, the goals are aligned, then those contributions will work for everyone. If a vendor tries to hijack a project, for example, by hiring all the developers, and then as the employer of these developers taking the project into a new direction, that will first be fought by the community. But then let's assume the vendor succeeds. This will be so upsetting to the rest of the community, which depends on the software, that a fork, meaning a copy and continuing with a copy under a new name, is likely. So I don't think it's so easy always to badly influence an open source project. And also that's related to how significant the project is. So the more economically significant, the more eyes are watching.
Prof, sorry for interrupting, but the time for the second invited speaker actually already 3 minutes already passed. Thank you very, very much. So the rest of the question, they can, if they want to know, they can contact you via email or through the chat room. Thank you very, very much. Please join with me to thank Prof. Dirk for his excellent speech. Thank you very, very much, Prof, for being with us and having you as a great value for our consortium. Thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome. Please be in touch and I will answer in the chat.
Inshallah. This is for Prof. Dirk. Since still in our session, we have still a few more minutes, nearly 30 or more than 20 minutes actually. If you're still just interested, to answer the questions which were delivered already, because I informed the audience, but it seems they didn't contact you actually through the chat room. So if you are willing, we have enough time, Prof. Dirk.
Sure, I'll be happy to help out.
Thank you very much.
In the Q&A, you're saying to answer the Q&A, or how to do that?
We have, I don't know, the 2 questions now. Yes, thank you, Prof. Dirk. Yes, we have it, please. You can just see 2 questions. It's still just in there. They are in the Q&A box, please.
So I think you're pointing to what is the most common concerning issues about open source software for most institutions who want to migrate there, I think. Common concerns. Well, you need to build up understanding of how to work with open source. So if you don't know software, it's quite tricky because software and software businesses don't really work like physical products. So you need competent people. I think that's the biggest challenge, having people who understand how software works, how to work with software suppliers and so forth. And that applies to software in general and certainly also to open source software. So there's no magical solution here. One way or another, you need to build up your understanding of how to work with software. You can buy into it to some extent by using the guidance, for example, of open source foundations. As I explained, they exist to help make sure that maybe any funds you have to spend on sponsoring open source software development are actually used in such a way that you reach your goals. If you have the competencies, you can do it yourself, but in general, the open source foundations are there to help you, and they are a neutral and fair playing ground because that's the reputation to lose if they were not. Do you think transitioning to open source software will be welcomed by software vendors like Microsoft? This is actually a very deep question. So to many, Microsoft is still the Microsoft of Microsoft Office and so forth. And certainly the traditional Microsoft of Windows and Office on-premise fought open source tooth and nail. And so in the old days, that was really a fight. The reality is that you can migrate to the alternatives like LibreOffice, but that your users may not be happy because lock-in has so many dimensions. Just knowing your way around software and having to learn a new software keeps people away. So many users may not be happy to migrate to LibreOffice. You need to convince them, you need to create incentives. The Microsoft of today, I'm not so sure about them varying so much. They use the login into Microsoft Office, meaning users know on a simple level where the menu items are, on a more complex level of how complex processes or macros in Excel work. They use that to keep you tied to Word and Excel, but they are trying to bring you into their cloud. So I think the Microsoft of today is really trying to rapidly migrate you into their cloud. The value is to them, they can charge even higher fees because, well, it's not just the software. Now it's also the service of operating the software for you. So subscription fees in total are usually higher than on-premise license and maintenance fees. So I think Microsoft has changed its strategy as a cloud vendor next to AWS and Google, and will try to migrate you to their cloud. Competing with that is really hard. I actually think that Microsoft stands a very good chance against Amazon and Google, simply because they're coming down this technology stack. What that means is, historically, it's been really hard for vendors to go up the stack. If you're an operating system provider, you found it really hard to suddenly develop good Office software. The other way works. So Microsoft can go down the stack, AWS will find it hard to go up the stack. So Microsoft does a lot of open source software now. They are not an enemy of open source, but they use it like everyone else to their strategic advantage. There's a lot of open source software in their old on-premise products and in their new in the cloud, but their strategy is definitely to get you into Azure and on Office 365.